Okay, and we're gonna probably keep you to 5 to 7 minutes so that we can, have time for discussion. Sabia, go ahead and get us started.
Okay, working. Cut me off when you need to.
Yes, and we had a timekeeper. Are you doing it? Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
super. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here, and this is a topic that is very important to me. I've thought about it a lot and talked a lot about this with other folks. And I've been asked to, as we're all kind of doing, making connections between gentrification and racism, and to be very clear that racism is an issue that, particularly in this city, and as it connects with gentrification, it affects Chinese people, Chinese Americans, it affects Latinos. I'm going to focus my comments on African Americans because that's what I do. That's my field. I study African American life and culture. So that's kind of my departure point. My time is also very limited, but I do want to share some background stuff if I can, because racism is. I taught at American University for 12 years. I taught a class called The Roots of Racism, and what I always had to do with that was really define racism. It's a word that people throw around a lot. They throw around accusations of racism, right? You're a racist. No, you're a racist for saying I'm a racist. I mean, you've heard it, right? It kind of goes around like that. So I had a working definition with my students. I would tell them that racism is the unequal distribution of power, privilege, and prestige based on race. Race was created by racism. We are, I'm not going to kumbaya, but we are a part of the human family, and all these various physical differences that you see among us are a product of human adaptation to the environment. So it's human beings that created racial categories and said that people with darker skin are going to be discriminated against, people with lighter skin are prettier, people with red hair are crazy. I mean, this is racism. This is racial, ideology. Another way you can look at it as, racism is discrimination associated with power. So racism is, it's very important to recognize that you've already heard that racism is institutional. It's built into the structure of society. And what that means is that policymakers, executives, police officers who are people of color can enforce racism against other people of color just as effectively as white people. It's about people having power and being in positions of power. That's what really counts. And I'll give you a quick example of that. Back in 2003, the same year the Empower DC was formed, a close friend of our family was an African American dentist. He was unarmed. He was shot and killed by another a off-duty police officer. That police officer did not serve any time rather. He wasn't found guilty of any sort of criminal charge. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? We've heard that. The color of the skin of the police officer is completely irrelevant. It's about the pattern. You don't hear about this happening to white folks. So it's about impact. It's not even about intent. It's about actual impact. You don't hear about white individuals being shot and killed by police officers of color, much less a white professional. So racism is allowed that to happen. And racism is a part of the legacy of white supremacy, and it's also about power and discrimination. And when we connect racism to gentrification, it really is less about hate, which is kind of like an easy go that people want to focus on in terms of racism is hate. But this kind of connection is less about hate and more about how centuries of racial inequality have come to impact economic conditions today. So let me quickly define gentrification. I think that's also important because in different locations around the city today, people are actually debating whether or not gentrification is a good or a bad thing. So if you get to the origins of the concept, you can really bypass that entire debate. Because Ruth Glass is the person that coined the term. She was a sociologist doing work in London, England during the 1960s. She coined the term to draw attention to something that was not right. Okay, she was witnessing the neglect of urban areas and what happens when that neglect is reversed and resources start getting pumped into the area, and the people that have access to those resources come into the area, and then people who are poor or working class become displaced. All right, that's what gentrification is. As you can hear from this definition, a key component to it is class. But race and class are not strangers to each other. They are cousins. They are intertwined. They're overlapping. And what that means is that gentrification is a process that is affected by class as much as it is affected by racism. And one of the quickest ways you can describe this is to connect it to racism and gentrification to economic factors and how those economic factors overlap with race. And I think some of that has already been done. Teresa kind of did that. But let's go over it a little bit. African Americans have experienced really extensive forms of discrimination that have resulted in wealth and income inequalities. It's also the case that structural and institutional racism have made the road to progress for African Americans and other folk of color much more difficult. And at the same time, it's also given the dominant group unearned privileges. In terms of gentrification, those folks that have wealth and have income, and also they may have connections to other people who have wealth and income. Those are the people who are in a better position to benefit from what is right now one of the hottest real estate markets in the nation. These are the folks who have economic resources to purchase expensive condos or very expensive homes. They have the credit to get the loans. They don't suffer from discrimination when they go for loans, whether it's home improvement, equity loans, whatever the case may be. They have middle-class backgrounds to obtain loans from their parents or their grandparents to start a business or to buy a home. These kind of loans we refer to as intergenerational transfers of wealth. And for very obvious reasons, if you're from a low-income background, you simply don't have access to those important resources. It's also the case that if you earn a low income, you are not going to necessarily be able to, you're spending, number one, a larger percentage of your earning on housing, and that's going to be a problem with saving money to invest with or to purchase a home. And just really quickly background, Oliver and Shapiro wrote a book back in, I think it was 1993, called Black Wealth, White Wealth. If anybody wants to follow up on that. It was a groundbreaking study, and it really kind of laid the groundwork for why African Americans don't have the same wealth as white Americans in this country. And for the reasons that they laid out, black elders will generally not be children or their grandchildren in ways without especially the black folks are able to do. It's certainly the case that individual black folks can do that, but I'm talking large numbers, right? Individual folks, sure, they can do that. And there are other ways in which this plays out, this economic connection and this race gentrification connection, and plays out across D.C. When it comes to elders, when they pass away, elderly homeowners, when they pass away, their children may not have the resources to take on those mortgages and keep the property in the family's hands. When homes fall into disrepair, owners may not have the money to do the needed renovations. This is what we saw when Georgetown was whitened and black folks were gentrified out of that. That was one of the ways in which that occurred, in addition to legislation removing people. When an area has been designated historical, homeowners may not have the resources to make the necessary adjustments to adhere to the code enforcement. That's another way in which that occurs. And I have some others, but I'm going to move on because I want to make sure I don't lose time here. So these are economic conditions that overlap with race in the ways that I've already outlined. But let's quickly touch upon how urban areas became neglected in the first place, all right? Some of it's already been detailed, the role of poverty, the lack of resources fueled by racial inequality. But let's also include more active rather than passive forms of racism, such as redlining and blockbusting that was mentioned, the aggressive collaborations between insurance companies and realtors to, in the case of redlining, deny African Americans housing or improvement funds. There's also blockbusting, going door to door, in the past, scaring white folks into leaving the city, telling them that the black hordes are coming and motivating them to sell cheap, and really kind of capitalizing on the bigotry that was already there. And then there's also black flight, which began after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King and the uprisings that those generated. Up until that point, the African American population was increasing very gradually, and I'm not trying to be too simplistic here, but I do want to connect a few dots. And as I wrap up, and then perhaps we can talk about some of this during the discussion session. Dr. King, the so-called dreamer, was actually a radical champion for anti-militarism and for economic justice. And he was vilified by many, and the circumstances of his assassination were quite questionable, as we know. He was an activist because of racism and because of class inequality. He was killed to protect the interests of racism and class inequality. And these are the factors that also fueled the uprisings of 1968, which reflected folks' frustration around class and racism. And, their frustration about the death of their freedom fighter as well. So, this whole black flight peace, after the 1970 census, you see the percentage of black folks begin to decline. And certainly some people have vilified African Americans for leaving the city at that time. I mean, I feel blessed that my parents didn't leave. They stayed, but I've gained another perspective on that from doing my research and talking to folks and collecting oral histories with folks, and I found that it really was vulnerability that black folks had that motivated many people to leave. They were vulnerable because they could not protect their assets, they couldn't protect the value of their homes, and they also couldn't sometimes protect their own bodies. And here I'm referring to, doing oral histories with people telling me that how they would call the police to come and they just had a lack of police response, lack of concern, wrap it up. Okay.
Yeah.
Around that. So, what does all this mean, for today? It's the very neighborhoods that have experienced the out-migration that are now targeted for gentrification, right? These are where people experience neglect, marginalization, righteous anger, black and white flight, all this race-class drama. These are the sites for gentrification right now. And what kind of baggage do people bring into communities when, that you're grappling with legacy of white supremacy and segregation? These things don't evaporate into thin air. People come into neighborhoods that are scary or allegedly scary. People have maps up for other gentrifiers about what areas to avoid, what areas are good or bad, etc. These kind of attitudes, what kind of relationships do you think are established in communities when people come into neighborhoods with these sorts of attitudes? There are plenty of exceptions, and again, we may be able to go into it a little more later, but it's a lot of fear and distrust that I'm talking about here. And so people bring their bigotry, their white privilege, their sense of entitlement into communities, which motivates them to want to change the communities, not adhere to the practices that people have established for decades, want to bring in more people that look like them so they can be more comfortable. So I'll conclude now by saying that my research and my writing, I link the concepts of gentrification to vulnerability, and race and class have a lot to do with this. Poverty breeds vulnerability, neglect breeds vulnerability, over-incarceration breeds vulnerability, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sabia.